Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, if you paid any attention to British politics since the Brexit referendum, you've probably seen and heard one sentiment expressed more than any other by some of the most ardent pro-EU voices in Westminster, and even by some in the government. Let's take a look.
Nobody voted on the 23rd of June to make this country poorer.
Nobody voted to be poorer.
And nobody in this process voted to be poorer.
Nobody voted to be poorer.
The country didn't vote to make itself poorer.
When the British people voted last June, they did not vote to become poorer.
Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, at the end there, echoing a sentiment expressed by many across the political spectrum. But even if the jury's yet to return a verdict on how the EU will affect people's finances, were some people who voted Brexit prepared to take an economic hit if that was the price of leaving the EU? Well, to discuss this, we're joined by David Goodhart from the Policy Exchange think tank. He's also the author of The Road to Somewhere, which, amongst other things, explores why people voted for Brexit. Welcome to the Daily Politics again.
Thank you very much.
Do you think people were prepared to take an economic hit in order to take back control, to use another phrase?
I think they would rather not, but I think a lot of people did vote knowing that their pockets might be hit, but regarding it as a reasonable trade-off. I mean, we might be a few £100 richer in 10 years' time, but our democratic accountability would be weaker, our national identity would be weaker if we remained in the European Union. A lot of people thought. I actually voted Remain, but I actually think that they are right about that.
Right. Rachel Shabby, do you agree? Do you accept that there were plenty of people who did feel it was worth economic uncertainty, let's put it like that, and potentially being slightly worse off in order to regain some sense of national identity in the way that David has outlined?
I mean, I think national identity is a phrase that's doing a lot of work in that sentence. It's very hard to discern what it was that people actually did vote for, and that's precisely why we're having such difficulties with the negotiations, because we're trying to find out what is it that people wanted from Brexit. Nobody actually said that, and that wasn't on the ballot. But I don't think these kind of cultural concerns, I mean, that seems to me a proxy for what can only be described as xenoracism. And I don't think we should be making any political decisions on that basis or implying that people's lives will be improved on that basis, because they won't.
Wrong. I find myself much more favourable to Brexit now, partly because of the arguments that I hear from you. I mean, from the militant Remainers, we hear either sheer economism, that this is a disaster because we're going to be £200 poorer in 5 years' time, or we voted Brexit because British people are basically racists, or nearly 50% of them are xenophobes and racists. I think neither of those things are true. There will be an adjustment cost, but I suspect in 5 or 10 years' time we will be just as rich as we would have been. But of course it's about taking control of, I mean, this is the first big pushback against the shrinkage of the democratic space that has happened in all industrial countries, all big democracies. I mean, if you think of the way the WTO, the way that European integration, the way that even a lot of domestic policies like independence of the Bank of England, judicial activism, have shrunk the democratic space. What is, I think, rather exciting about Brexit is this is the first pushback against that shrinkage.
But although there may be an acceptance that people might have been prepared to take an economic hit, we don't know how they thought that was going to manifest itself. I mean, do you think there were a broad set of reasons for people voting leave? And as Rachel said, and that's made it difficult for the negotiations, because did people sit down and say, yes, we're going to leave the single market and the customs union, and if that makes me a bit poorer for 5 years, well, so be it?
Well, I mean, we have to be sceptical about polling after the events of the last few years, but there are quite detailed series of polls done on testing attitudes afterwards on what people thought that they were doing. Immigration tends to come second. First tends to come the question of self-government and the country making its own laws, which I think, I mean, what's astonishing about the British political class is that it was so shocked by the result. It's been apparent since around about the time of Maastricht that something close to a majority of British voters were sceptical about excessive political integration and were never asked the question, and then the first time the question was put to them, they delivered a pretty clear answer. In terms of did people vote to be poorer, I mean, that question itself is a piece of sophistry.
Right.
But I certainly voted knowing that that was a possibility, and I know many Leave voters who voted thinking that it was a price worth.
Right. OK, so it is worth some economic turmoil in that sense.
To a lot of Leave voters, people heard the warnings, calculated that there might be some hit, there might not. It depends on things which haven't happened yet. But that if there is a hit, a moderate hit, an adjustment cost, then it is something worth living for self-government.
And people said that it was worth it because Britain could then make the decisions over a whole wide range of issues, including laws, including borders, including money. And that was more important.
Unfortunately, people were sold this idea of taking back control. That doesn't mean anything. That's just an empty slogan.
It's not an empty
when we
slogan.
talk about a democratic deficit, when we talk about the unaccountability of WTO, the unaccountability of banks and multinationals, that is a very separate thing from the issue of the EU. And that's exactly the success of the Leave campaign, was that it managed to divert a lot of very reasonable concerns, economic concerns, into something that was essentially an ethno-nationalist lie that we now can't execute.
Huge areas of life that, because of European integration, we could not control inside the EU. You know, immigration, farm subsidies, public procurement, contracting out rules, data protection, new technology. The way in which different countries balance risk is hugely different from country to country, and yet we're sort of squeezed into often, German-related anxieties about data protection and things. We have to pay huge tariffs on shoes to protect the Italian shoe industry. I mean, there are all sorts of areas where we can reclaim sovereignty. This is not a fantasy. Now, liberal technocrats tend to see the pooling of sovereignty as a kind of act of empowerment, that the fact that democracy cannot function only at the nation-state level. They celebrate. I think a lot of ordinary voters see that as disempowering. That's taking away their sovereignty.
Right, but David, if people are feeling poorer at the moment because of higher inflation or wage stagnation, because in the aftermath of that EU vote, obviously there's been a devaluation of the pound, do you think they might link that to the EU referendum and say, actually, I might have changed my mind now? The reality of that economic hit in their minds is playing out, particularly when the Treasury analysis says it's those areas with the highest percentage, or some of the highest percentage of Leave voters, could be the ones worst affected.
Yes, I mean, I think it obviously depends on how things work out, and it depends partly on how the negotiations go and whether and how bullying the European Union are perceived to be. But I think, I mean, as Ian was saying earlier, I mean, trade with the EU is about 10% of GDP. Even if it falls 20%, which is far greater than the most pessimistic accounts, that means GDP will fall by less than it fell in the financial crisis.
But do you think people might change their mind? They might come to regret what they thought was worth taking an economic hit for?
That's possible. There's no sign of it yet. But I think where the Labour Party has a real advantage here, and where Corbyn and McDonnell are ahead of the game, is that because the Tories are so focused on the rather shambolic negotiations, already Labour, and in that keynote speech that Corbyn gave last week, already Corbyn is talking about Britain after Brexit. And I think the Labour understanding is correct, that once Brexit is a done deal, and it happens in one form or another, there will then be a battle for the votes of people in areas that voted for Brexit who really want to see some concrete improvements.
David Goodhart, thank you.
I've been getting away with it.